Counter-swapping is the essence of Overwatch. Well, so says ML7 in his most recent tweet, discussing one of the biggest problems that he thinks that there is with Overwatch, or maybe it's not even a complaint, maybe it's just a statement. Awkward, one of the most well-known educational content creators, formerly #1 support player, and still remarkably good at this video game, responds the most definitely with a screenshot of him being in rank #9, playing only one character, Yari, which then leads to a response with ML7. I do this every season on an account when a new support is released to learn them, when to switch from them, and when they work best, since I don't do unranked GMs anymore. This is not the burn that you think it is. So I want to talk about this because I actually think this discussion is really important, something that I've talked about before in previous videos, but I want to elaborate on a little bit deeper in this video. What is the truth of counter-swapping in Overwatch 2, and how much of a problem is it right now? Now, I want to be very clear. I think both of these guys are absolutely correct, and I both think that they're absolutely wrong in some aspects. As usual, my stance is somewhere nuanced, and I want to talk about why my nuanced stance, I think, is really important for most people to hear. I also want to point out a couple of the tweets here where Awkward posts that not only his account with Yari, but also then shows on his own a couple of accounts that are rank #12, actually rank #7 peak, one-tricking Brigitte, a one-trick Roadhog, ranked #2 on tank, and then rank #1 Wrecking Ball, and then two an OTP Symmetra accounts, two both ranked 1 and 2. Now, the obvious response is that there is an exception to the rule from Motion Gaming here. This exception to the statement doesn't make the statement false. I could say humans are born with 2 legs. Are there rare cases when that is not the case? Sure. Does that make it false? No. Use a handful of cases on the top 5 lane doesn't represent millions of others. But the problem with that, though, is that actually, if anything, counter-swapping in lower ranks may feel like a much bigger issue, but in my experience, it's actually more of a skill issue than it is a counterpicking issue. So in lower ranks, counterpicking may feel easier in some aspects, but there's also a lot more room for skill issue in understanding how to adapt your playstyle. So I actually completely disagree with this. I think that, yes, there's obviously going to be always exceptions to the rule. It doesn't mean that the fundamental thing is wrong. I agree with that. However, it fails to account for the fact that lower ranks have also a lot more variability in some of the other factors as well. And what Awkward's preaching here to the vast majority of people looking at this tweet is really totally correct. Now, let's talk about the ease of counter-swapping, because this is something that I've been very in between on. Now, a lot of people may have seen the truth of rock, paper, scissors, tank, and Overwatch 2, and why it's a myth, and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of people miss the nuance in that video. And they talk about the problem with counter-swapping, when and where it's a problem, notice who I just picked here, is not necessarily the counter-swapping itself, but the ease of counter-swapping. So even if Bastion doesn't come by himself totally shut down to Winston, I think he can come pretty darn close. It's how easy you're able to get value with his character in comparison to a character like Winston. You see, it's not just a counter-swapping problem, it's a skill curve problem. Notice that all of the characters in Overwatch 2, when it comes to counter-swapping, it's not just about the ability to counter what you're playing versus, it's the ability to counter what you're playing versus with significantly less effort. And I think that's the key thing. Whenever you're playing a Reinhardt into a Orisa, whether that's an actual counter swap or not, the feeling of being unable to do anything versus the Orisa, while she requires a lot less effort to do the exact same thing, is what makes people frustrated. See, the Overwatch 2 was released with a philosophy of dynamics, with a departure of hard counters, a reduction in CC, and for the most part, it's really been a failure. Even if there are still ways to one-trick Winston and one-trick Symmetra and one-trick Tracer to find success, those things are harder than they should have been, and even when they're not harder, they feel harder. And see, this was another point that I discussed in the rock, paper, scissors, tank video, is even if you can't hard counter Reinhardt with Orisa, which I would argue that it's generally very difficult to, it still feels like you do. You see, the difference between feeling like you're getting value and the actual getting of value can be very different things. In fact, one of the things that was very interesting in the recent patch notes is they talked about Orisa's win rate is actually not all that good, and in low ranks, Reinhardt's win rate is actually the best of all tanks. But if you've ever played Reinhardt in low ranks, it actually doesn't really feel like that consistently. So you see the feeling of getting value versus actually getting value are two very different things, indirect versus direct value. And that is something that, while we can sit here and understand that that's something to keep in mind when I'm getting hard countered, maybe I'm not actually getting hard countered, but it's still not a fun experience. And when we're talking about problems with Overwatch 2, the getting of value and the feeling of getting value need to be about the same. That needs to be the goal. We need to make it rewarding getting indirect value. We should feel like, even if I'm not necessarily directly getting kills, that it feels rewarding. And so if something is all about the indirect value but feels terrible along the way, if I'm getting counter-swapped and we're still winning the game, but it feels garbage for me, that's not good game design. Because first of all, game is not just about winning, it's about actually having fun. So if I'm playing Winston to Bastion, Reaper, Diva, all characters that require less effort to counter me than it does for me to play the game, if we still win the game because they're counterpicking me, unless you're a little bit like sadistic like myself and enjoy laughing at the enemy team's incompetence while I die over and over and over again, that's not exactly a very fun experience. And a lot of this is, I hate to bring up this, part of it is a 5v5 issue where it is easier to counterpick one person on the enemy team, whether it's a tank, DPS, or support, because there's fewer bodies on the battlefield. So that's not necessarily a reason why I'm against 5v5. I do enjoy 5v5, but it is a weakness of 5v5 that needs to be factored into balance. So you're noticing that I'm saying over and over and over again all the issues of this and that 5v5, but the reality of the situation is, for the vast majority of players, bronze, silver, gold, plat, diamond masters, and even grandmaster, if you're struggling versus counters with most characters in most situations on most maps, it's a skill issue. It's an issue of you being unable to either understand the matchup, being able to adjust your playstyle, and quite frankly, it's an emotional response. You see, when we talk about the frustration of, I want to play Diva, somebody goes Zarya, if you don't have the understanding of how to adapt your playstyle into that, not only are you more likely to struggle with the adapting and countering, but you're not really in a good headspace to adapt. Because if I go Zarya and I'm like, or they go Zarya and I'm like, now I'm not really thinking about how I can adjust, how I can play. I'm only focusing on the frustration of being counterpicked, so I'm not really in a headspace to learn or adapt with the situation. And to be honest with you, that's something that needs to be said a lot more. And give Awkward credit. Awkward has consistently been the guy that's been speaking up over and over again about personal responsibility, taking accountability for your actions, for your rank, for your ability to improve, and learning how to play and how to adapt around your counters. And I think that's very important. And the vast majority of players need to hear that, while also admitting that it is not something that we necessarily want for the game long term. We don't necessarily, it had to require that level of mental fortitude to be able to do the same amount of things. And I think that shouldn't be a hot take. So ML7, I want to call you out here. Remember your audience. Their main problems are not that they picked the wrong hero or whether they picked the right hero, but that they have a very limited understanding of the character, and you do not understand how to adapt and how to adjust. You don't want to encourage the wrong thing by having people focusing on Overwatch as a countering game. Arguably, that's not even necessarily true in higher ranks as much to people's perception, but certainly in low to mid ranks. You need to be saying that Overwatch has a counter-swapping problem. But most of Overwatch is not. Most of Overwatch is actually a skill issue and your ability to adapt your playstyle and adjust, and the perception of value versus the actual getting of value itself, as we discussed earlier. Now, I understand Twitter is not exactly the place for nuance, but that's why I'm making a video and not a tweet. Awkward. Please remember that your ability to apply yourself doesn't mean that others aren't operating at a disadvantage. I think it's great that you and your students have been able to apply themselves and learn how to get past these disadvantages and learn the value of indirect versus direct value and adjust playstyle. And I think that's what makes you one of the greatest educators in the Overwatch 2 headspace. However, we can also admit the fact that the feeling of value and the getting of value, there's too much of discrepancy. And that, in addition, that many of these counters are just simply too easy to play. We have a systemic balance issue right now where there are too many characters that just their existence provide or deny too much value. We talk about Bastion being a great example here because Fearless, arguably the greatest Winston player in the world, has major problems with Bastion. And we just got off of an Overwatch League grand final meta where the existence of Bastion is why teams were not able to play Winston. And Bastion was used at the Overwatch League level as a counter pick. And when we've gotten to that point with certain characters, then you know you have a problem. Now, I do agree that there are many counter picks in Overwatch 2 that are wildly overrated. Reinhardt and Orisa is one of them. I think Reaper and Winston is one of them. But certainly, even in those examples there, it shouldn't feel as bad as it does right now. And I think that that's the thing. A public stance and balance is different than a personal accountability stance. You can support both. And that's something that I've always been trying to do. When I'm speaking publicly, I'm calling Overwatch 2 and Blizzard out for their poor balancing, for the indirect versus direct value, have the ease of access, the skill curve issue. But when I'm working with a character one-on-one or working with a person one-on-one, character one-on-one, when I'm working with somebody one-on-one or just talking about personal accountability in Overwatch and an educational format, 9 times out of 10, it's a skill issue, guys, and you really do need to adapt and adjust. So, main takeaway, when do you swap? Does Overwatch 2 have a counter-swapping problem? Yes, it does. but it is vastly overrated because the vast majority of people that are talking about it are playing not only at a higher level where counter swapping is more of that 1%, 2% difference that matters, but the vast majority of people aren't even playing in the rank where it matters. But the other issue is that I do think that we have an issue where too many characters are easy to play and deny value out of. Now, the key thing is, when do you swap in Overwatch? When do you swap off of Winston? When do you swap off of Hanzo? When do you swap off of Widowmaker? Well, I'm about to release a video later this week discussing that in full. I did a full DPS tank support counter discussion, and there's going to be a lot of discussion on maps as well, so stay tuned for that later this week. So, main takeaway. Let's address the systemic issues of ease of access of counters and the overall skill/power curve. Admit that some people, some characters just have an advantage. And that's definitely a problem in the system that we have currently with Overwatch 2. But we also need to admit that personal play will always be the most important factor in adapting playstyle. And player perception of whether the pick or the play was the problem will always be difficult. You see, I don't trust anybody, Overwatch League, top 500, Grandmaster, or Bronze, to always make an accurate read of whether the pick was the problem or whether the person playing the character was the problem, the way that they played the character. And so that's always important to remember. Most often, it's usually the play. Sometimes it's the pick, sometimes it's not. If that sounds a little bit like social commentary, well, draw your own conclusions. Take personal responsibility, address systemic issues. We can have our cake and eat it too. I'll see you guys later this week with a discussion on actually when do you need to be swapping.